Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA grades against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0, and it's not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributing to a championship. I know including All-Star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan voted, but ultimately this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. The 15th episode in the series looks at 2 all-time power forwards who dominated their competition at their peak, and both underrated for different reasons. Chris Webber is best known as a promising talent who played his prime for the Washington Bullets and Sacramento Kings, and almost led him to a championship. But because he never won a championship and had his career cut short by injury, he isn't remembered quite as well as Duncan or KG or others who played during his time. Spencer Haywood is even less well remembered since he played in the 1970s and was the Seattle Supersonics' first superstar. He won an MVP in the ABA, putting up dominant numbers, and then spent the rest of his prime with the Sonics, winning a ring as a bench player for the LA Lakers. Which player had the better career? Let's find out. In this category, both players were fantastic scorers. They both averaged over 20 points per game for their careers. Webber averaged 20.7 points per game for his career, peaking at 27.1 points per game in 2001, and 18.7 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 24.4 points per game in 2000, while Haywood averaged 20.3 points per game for his career, peaking at a monstrous 30 points per game in his rookie season, the ABA in 1970. While in the playoffs, he averaged 19.6 points per game, peaking at a crazy 36.7 points per game in the ABA playoffs in 1970. Haywood definitely had the higher peak, as he had absolutely dominant rookie season in the ABA, and also won a scoring title that year as well. However, just like in my previous videos where I compared Connie Hawkins to Billy Cunningham and Roger Brown to James Worthy, I find the comparison with early ABA years quite hard to judge, as it was clear that the early ABA years up to 1971 definitely had a reduced level of competition compared to the NBA. Not to say that these ABA numbers weren't impressive, but both Haywood's and Hawkins' numbers were more comparable to their counterparts Webber and Cunningham once they entered the NBA. Haywood still had the higher peak comparing his Sonics prime to Webber's Kings prime, but Webber was slightly more consistent throughout his career, and just like with a lot of my other comparisons of dominant prime versus solid consistency, I'll have to call this category a tie. In the rebounding category, it's also pretty close. Webber averaged 9.8 rebounds for his career, peaking at 13 rebounds a game in 1999, and 8.7 rebounds a game in the playoffs, peaking at 11.5 a game in 2001. Haywood averaged 10.3 rebounds a game for his career, peaking at an insane 19.5 rebounds per game in 1970, and 9.4 rebounds a game in the playoffs, peaking at a crazy 19.8 rebounds per game in 1970. Once again, we have to take into consideration that the ABA had a faster pace and questionable competition at that time, and thus rebounding numbers for Haywood look quite astonishing because of that. Both players have one rebounding title, and we also have to keep in mind that Webber's rebounding numbers came at a time when the NBA's pace was the slowest it's ever been, in the late 90s and early 2000s. So given that Haywood played in a faster-paced league, and Webber played in a slower-paced one, the fact that they both had a rebounding title, and both averaged over 10 rebounds a game 6 times in their career, I'll have to call this category a tie as well, despite Haywood's better numbers on paper. In the passing category, it's not even close, as Webber was clearly the better passer of the two. Webber was one of the best passing power forwards of all time, as he averaged 4.2 assists per game for his career, peaking at 5.4 assists per game in 2003, and 3.6 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at a point guard like 9 assists per game in 1994. Haywood was a more traditional power forward and didn't assume distributing duties very often, averaging only 1.8 assists per game in his career, peaking at 3.2 a game in 1974, and 1.8 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at 3.3 a game in 1970. So this category clearly goes to Webber. In the efficiency and advanced metrics category, both players were talented scorers who could muscle their way into the paint and score, and both were great interior scorers who could also score from mid-range as well. They both had similar true shooting percentage, the reason being that Haywood was not quite as efficient as Webber, but a better free throw shooter, while Webber was more efficient on his field goals but wasn't a good free throw shooter, so they end up having a similar true shooting percentage. Their PER and win shares per 48 are also close enough, so I can't really say one has a clear advantage over the other. Ultimately, I'll have to say that this category is another tie. In the defense category, neither player had any all-defensive selections or Defensive Player of the Year, but Webber was a fairly solid defender, backed up by his substantial defensive win shares count. Haywood's defense was also solid, but in this case all I have to go on is defensive win shares given the lack of any other awards for both players, and Webber does have a decent margin lead over Haywood here, so this category will go to Chris Webber. In the awards category, both players had 5 All-Star appearances, but Haywood has a championship, albeit as a bench player. Haywood also has 2 more All-NBA first-team selections than Webber and an ABA MVP, giving him a substantial advantage in this category. One can make an argument that Webber played in an era with a substantial amount of great power forwards, including Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki, Rasheed Wallace, Elton Brand, Paul Gasol, Amari Stoudemire, and Chris Bosh, while Haywood's competition was limited to Dave DeBusschere, Bob Love, and Elvin Hayes. But Haywood's MVP and All-NBA selections do give him the win here, so this category goes to Spencer Haywood. So when all the categories are summed up, Chris Webber wins the passing and defense categories, while Spencer Haywood takes the awards category, with the rest being a tie, giving Chris Webber the win. I know in this comparison I was being a bit unfair to Spencer Haywood because I was heavily discounting his ABA stats, but I also did this for Connie Hawkins and George McGinnis as well, since their numbers dropped when they transitioned to the NBA too. It's quite clear that the ABA definitely had a higher pace compared to the NBA at that time. And in this comparison, it's especially notable that Webber was able to average his numbers despite playing at historically slow paces in the NBA, which is why I had to give him more credit here, even though his numbers didn't look as crazy as Haywood's did. Nevertheless, Spencer Haywood has to be appreciated as he was one of the most dominant forwards of his era, a Seattle Supersonics legend, and is today mostly a forgotten player, while Chris Webber is known as one of the greatest Sacramento Kings players of all time, and one of the best all-around players at his position. Both averaged 20 and 10 for their careers and had to wait quite some time to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. In fact, Chris Webber just got in this year. I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Hope you guys learned something new. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.